All right, go ahead and have a seat, everybody. Okay, we are back on the record after our mid-morning break. We have the jury, counsel, and parties present. We have Mr. Martin on the stand. And, sir, I would just remind you that even though we took a break, you're still under oath.
Yes, Your Honor.
And with that, Mr. Ringel, you may resume your direct examination.
Thank you, Judge. Could we lower the lights just a little bit? Thank you. Showing you what's been marked in your report, Mr. Martin, as number 13, it's State's Exhibit 229. What are we seeing there?
This is the stairway that comes down from the upper level. I believe it was referred to the sewing room of the home. I don't know if the jury can see it, but may I stand, Your Honor?
You may.
Thank you. If we look here, or on the monitor here, if you look here, I placed a green arrow in the photograph at the base of the stairs on the right hand of that riser. And in the next photograph, what we'll see is the blood stain at the base of the stairs. This is, again, to orient you as to where that stain was located.
State's Exhibit 230, your number 14, is that the blood stain you were just referencing?
Yes, sir. So, again, the evidence placard was placed by the investigators here. And what we can see is, again, we have the scale here, placard number 1, stain. Notice we have a circular stain there. So what we have, circular stain, it appears to be a drip stain at the base of the stairs. The thing that we look at, okay, so I have a drip stain here. Well, if I have a drip stain, is it isolated? This appears to be isolated because, at least from the investigative reports, and I can only work with the information that I have. So essentially, could there be some latent stains there? In other words, and let me just say that, excuse me 1 minute. Let me just say this. There are two types of blood stains. There are patent stains, P-A-T-E-N-T. Those are readily visible. There could also be latent stains there. In other words, I could have had a little bit of blood, and let's just use the example of my footwear. It comes up to a point where you don't see the blood anymore on the surface, and let's say the floor. But as I walk along, there's still trace amounts. So that's what we call a latent, because if I take a particular chemical and I treat it, it will actually make that blood stain, which is otherwise invisible, visible. So what we could have here is we obviously have a latent that appears to be a drip stain. Could there have been additional stains? I didn't see any, nor were there any recorded in the report, leading to, and I use the term the living room, or where Mr. Cooper was found, nor did investigators detect anything else. So this just happens to be a, if you want to call it a random stain with no association. Because if I did have, and let's just say I have this drip stain here, drip stain here, drip stain here, many times what we do is we follow, obviously, the drip stains. That's called the drip trail. It tells us where many times it's coming from and where it's going to. But again, this happens to be an isolated stain. It wasn't tested for blood, but at least in my opinion, it appears to be blood. And certainly it appears to be Mr. Cooper's. Could have been from a separate incident. I've certainly had cases where there are blood stains pre-existing in the house that came not only from residents there, but from a previous resident of that apartment. So again, here we have this isolated blood stain, which really doesn't have any connection through a drip trail or any other format.
And Judge, with the court's permission, it looks like 305 has been taken down. I'm going to republish that, if that's okay.
Okay.
I may have to stand. Sorry.
All right. Moving on to State's Exhibit number 231, marked in your report as number 15. What are we seeing here?
So this is a photograph which was taken off the body cam. It's a still frame. And essentially, as the first officer is coming into the room here, his body camera is working. And again, I have the ability to take a frame off of that. And what we have here is we have Karina Cooper here. You can see her as she's straddling. In fact, this happens to be her left leg here. And we can, may I stand, Your Honor?
You may.
Thank you. We can see that she's on the Mr. Cooper here. And again, one of the things that we look at, even though it's a photograph that appears to be out of focus, or again, it's a body camera, it's moving. So again, what happens is we have some motion in the camera itself. Right away, we start to look for, do I see any blood flow running down his legs, any blood flow here? What do I see? I can see the recliner. The recliner appears to be in the back position, in that reclined. I don't know how far back it reclines, but certainly we can see that the footrest is in the up position. We can also see here the quilt, because again, what are the positions of the items in the room, the evidence in the room? So we can see that there's a quilt behind Mr. Cooper as well.
And you stated that was a still from a body cam. It's noted there as body cam Fangman, I believe.
Yes, sir. Yes, I have it marked as Fangman. Yes, sir.
And for the record, Deputy.
Sir, do you want to pull your microphone down again?
I'm sorry, Your Honor. Yes, I have it marked as, it's a photo 15 body cam Fangman.
Just for the record, Deputy Fangman's body cam was previously admitted as State's Exhibit number 102. What are you seeing of relevance to your analysis? I know you already noted that you're looking at the position of the items in the room. You're also looking for flow patterns or the lack of flow patterns on the extremities of Mr. Cooper. Anything of note with regard to the fact that Karina Cooper is on top of the decedent?
So one of the things that we have to consider, and it always comes up, has the scene been altered? It can be intentional or it can be unintentional. So we know that Mr. Cooper, certainly 911 has been called, that he's incurred an injury. We can see that Karina Cooper is on top of him. So right away when we're doing an assessment, or at least I'm looking at the photographs, because ultimately she's removed from Mr. Cooper, we have to take into consideration that there's possible movement of Mr. Cooper by Karina Cooper. Not only that, but what has she touched that could have altered? For example, I could have some, or Mr. Cooper could have some blood on his face, could be moving that blood around, which could be changing the appearance of the stain. So in my analysis, if I had a flow pattern, so flow, as we talked about before, gravity's causing it to run down, well, I could see this movement. Now I know from the body camera, and that's why it's so important that you have to look at all of the evidence, whether it be video or photographic, to be able to account for what patterns we see at the scene.
And so would you characterize Ms. Cooper's actions sitting on top of the decedent here as altering the scene?
Yes, sir.
State's Exhibit number 232, again marked as body cam Fangman, marked in your report as number 16. What do we see here?
Again, Your Honor, may I stand, please?
You may.
Thank you. So what we do, again, we have Karina Cooper here on Mr. Cooper's lap. We can see her left arm is up by his face. And now we look at the entirety of the scene. Again, top of the recliner, we can see that there's I use the term quilt there. So in the subsequent photos or in the later photos, I want to see if the position of the quilt is as it's depicted here. Because certainly movement by her or movement in removing Mr. Cooper from the recliner could cause the actual movement of the quilt. Also, I have a better view of the room. I'm going to look at the whole room or the entire room. Here we can see this is the doorway to the outside. This is that front door I previously talked about, this being the east side of the dwelling. You can see that the door is closed. So again, was the door open and closed at the time first officers responded? At least here, the door is fully closed. Likewise, as we look in the area of this arm, the left arm of the recliner, I know from looking at the photos, because I looked at the photos prior to looking at the video, I look at the photos to determine, was there any blood staining on the arm of the chair? What is the extent of blood staining to Karina Cooper, if any? So again, even though this happens to be a out of focus, again, it's due to the movement. If he were standing still, would have a clearer picture. But again, I can see the quilt here. I can see her position. I know that obviously she's placed her at least left hand on the right side of his face.
Mr. Ringel, let me go ahead and have a seat, but let me just ask, do we need this up? I mean, it does make it so he has to stand more. Is there something else we can do with that?
Judge, we could put it behind the defense table. The purpose of it is to just allow him to show, as we move forward, the different areas where the photographs were taken.
Sure, I understand. It would just, I think, make it more convenient for him, and when he stands up, the microphone doesn't catch, and anyway, so if we could move that, I think, and then also he would have a view of the screen, too.
Your Honor, well, how about it? Could we put it here where she stepped down? This might be a, no.
I'll let Mr. Ringel and Mr. Kodiaga figure out maybe where it can go. That'll also allow Ms. Watt to get back to her original location.
Can you still see State's Exhibit 305?
Yes, sir, I can.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Ringel, you can go ahead whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Judge. You stated that you had looked at Deputy Fangman's body camera. You said you're using software that allows you to look at approximately 30 frames per second, if I remember correctly.
Yes, sir.
Were you able to determine in looking at that footage what Ms. Cooper is doing while she's on top of Ryan Cooper?
Well, and you'd have to look at the video, but you can see that she's placing her hand across Mr. Cooper and hugging him, as well as in the actual video you can hear her crying and commenting as well.
Were you able to determine if her face was making contact with...
Yes, sir, in the video, yes. In other words, her face was making contact with Mr. Cooper's face, almost a rubbing motion to the face, yes.
And were you able to tell if that was the left side or the right side of Mr. Cooper's face where she was making contact?
Well, at least in the portion of the video, it appeared to be the right side of the face, in one portion of the video that I specifically recall. Yes, sir.
And here it looks as though she's making contact with the left side of his face. Is that correct?
No, that would be the right side, sir. Right? His head is to her. His head is to her left. No, to her right. So his head is. Looks like her head is. This is his head back here on that side of her.
All right. So he's facing forward in the chair.
Right, so that would be the right side of his face. Her face is up against this left side here.
Okay, thank you.
I didn't touch anything.
All right, moving on to what's been marked as State's Exhibit 233, marked in your report as 17. What are we seeing here?
This is a photo which I was provided by Trent Villaret from DCI. This was in his report. I believe it came from one of the body cameras. I'm not sure, but prior to first responders arriving on the scene, and what we see here is Karina Cooper has been removed. And again, what we're looking at here is this is probably one of the earliest photos that we see. And again, we have Mr. Cooper here in the chair. Remember I talked about flow patterns, trying to determine as to whether he may have been standing at the time, kneeling at the time. Well, first of all, as we look, we see a saturation stain, and I did mention that briefly. Saturation stain is when I have blood that's on something that's porous, such as fabric or clothing. So we can see it's making its way down because of gravity, so it's making its way down, but I don't have any flow pattern going across his stomach. Again, these blankets could have been placed after, post-event, or they could have been there prior to, which again, I don't see any blood on them. Likewise, the other thing that we want to take a look at is his left arm, and one of what we're looking for there is, do we see any evidence, the flow pattern in the shirt? Notice, it comes down his sleeve, but there's still a couple of inches. Likewise, we have some blood out here, and I'll talk about that in later slides, but one of the reasons for this blood out here could have been his arm extended out here. So instead of his arm being flexed at the elbow, right here, as we see it, into his waist, if the position were out here, blood could have flowed down, because we know the wound is on that left side, could have flowed down his hand, and his fingers could have been here, which account for this, and we'll talk about that later. But from everything that we see, or I see, there's no evidence at all that he was anything other than this position. Likewise, again, what's around him, we can see that quilt. Here's the quilt behind him. We can see on the quilt that shiny area here on the, right side of his face is blood, clotted blood. We can also see over here there's some blood that's amassed here. So again, what we have is the quilt, he's up against it. There's no evidence at all of him in a position other than that reclining position. And again, generally, here's another photo to show that the door was closed at the time. We can see this large pattern here, because again, ultimately when first responders or investigators come to the scene, certainly the dynamics could have changed. You could have some flow going on that could have increased that pattern. So this gives me an idea, at least when this photo was taken, this was what the scene looked like. And again, we had Karina Cooper here. We do know that she was involved in some of the altering of the scene, whether, like I say, we don't know intentional or unintentional, but certainly that gives us an indication that, we have to consider that when we look at the case in summary.
To be clear then, from what you're observing here, this was taken pretty much immediately after Karina Cooper was removed.
Yes, sir.
And there was not a flow pattern down Ryan Cooper's left arm, correct?
Left arm, no, sir. Nor down nor his stomach.
The door is closed, and also there's a vent, I guess we'll say about the middle right of that image. Is that vent covered with a vent cover?
A floor vent, yes, sir. Hot air system, so we have a floor vent in the floor itself. In fact, one other of note, which is important in this case, this floor is actually particle board. At least that's the term I know it as. So unlike if this were a hardwood floor, granted you have a space between the floors, but the floor has been finished, so it's pretty much non-porous. Or if this were inlaid or some type of non-porous surface, the fact that we have this particle board that is somewhat porous, we have to take that into consideration when we're evaluating all of the evidence at the end of this.
There's some blood pools in this image. It sounds like from your testimony, if I understand correctly, there's some later images that are better to describe what's going on with those particular blood pools.
Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
State's Exhibit 234 marked in your report as 18.
Yes, sir. This is a photograph, obviously, was taken sometime later. The sun has come up. Mr. Cooper has been removed from the recliner. They've placed a sheet on the floor, and they've simply moved him from here to here. Again, the purpose of the photograph here is to give an overall view of the room, so we can see here's the door, and again, the door is still shut. But again, we have the recliner here, and ultimately Mr. Cooper here, but we look at the arm, we don't see any blood, because we didn't see the inside of the arm. So in this photograph here, we didn't see any on the outside, nor do we see any on the inside. Likewise, across the abdominal area, we don't see any blood. And even the left arm, nothing there and nothing in that thigh area of either leg or even the feet. So with each photograph, we're looking to say, okay, in the last photograph, there was no evidence of him being up at the time. Another photograph that supports the fact that he was in the recliner and it was reclined at the time of the discharge of the 2 shots.
Your number 19, State's Exhibit 235.
In this photograph here, what we're looking at is Mr. Cooper is back this way. This is the carpet that we noticed, or we noted Mr. Cooper on. This is heading out towards that, and this is the doorway that goes into that sewing room. So on the diagram, here's Mr. Cooper here. This is that area of the carpet, and this is that doorway that goes into that sewing room where that drop of blood was located. So here we are up in this area. That's heading through that doorway. I've got 2 different symbols here. I put the green ellipse. These are blood stains. They appear to be, notice the ellipses? Excuse me. Notice there's a tail going this way, so it's telling me that the blood actually hits, and it's actually going in this direction. When someone's going or something's going this way, that's bloody. Not only that, but here we have 2 footprints, not footwear, but 2 footprints. We can see the right foot here, and we can see the left foot here. Of note, when I reviewed the reports, there were additional bloody footprints which were on this carpet here. So what that tells me is after the time, after the event, the shooting, someone with bare feet stepped in the blood, went across the carpet, because again, relying on the reports, went across the carpet, and ultimately here to here. I didn't have any additional photos going into here, but as I mentioned before, the amount of blood diminishes. There could be additional going this way, but we at least have 2 footprints, one being right here, and excuse me, this is a right here, and this happens to be I'm sorry, right here. What did I say? Right, left? This appears to be a right as well, going towards the sewing room.
State's Exhibit 236, your number 20.
Sure. This is a photograph of Mr. Cooper's right foot and his lower leg. What we see there on him, this appears to be a transfer stain, and that something bloody came in contact with Mr. Cooper's foot. We see a transfer stain here on the bottom, but again, we don't see any drips up top, nor do we see any flow. But in reviewing the reports, there was a statement by Karina Cooper as to grabbing Mr. Cooper's foot as she climbed on top of him. So certainly the possible origin of this is with a bloody hand as you are climbing on top of, or as she was, climbing on top of Mr. Cooper. That could have been the transfer stain as she's climbing up.
State's Exhibit 237, you are 21.
Again, this happens to be Mr. Cooper's left foot as he's on the floor. And again, the purpose is to note that there is no blood on the bottoms of his feet, no blood drips on the top of his feet, and again, nothing flowing down his leg. Because with each photo that we look at, if we're saying that there's no evidence of him being up, we need to keep looking over, and what we're doing is we're trying to falsify, or we're trying to prove that there is no other evidence other than him being in that reclined position as we see him.
This is State's Exhibit 238, your 22.
So here we have Mr. Cooper. We can see that this is the white sheet that he was placed on, and obviously they place a clean sheet down prior to putting Mr. Cooper on there, and we can see blood stains here. The term that we use is that he's still purging. So in other words, he has blood. Obviously there's a breach in his circulatory system. There's blood, which is amassed. Remember I talked about before, he has damage here. So we note that he's still bleeding as he's here. And granted, these are the only 2 wounds. You're going to get some from the nose and mouth due to the fracture of the cranium of the skull. You're going to get bleeding in there. What's causing that? So we see this, but I've placed 2 arrows. And what we see in this one here, this is the left shoulder, we see some clots here. So again, clotting tells us that there's been some time that has elapsed for this clot to have amassed. Likewise, I've put a green arrow towards the right here. We can see a clot here, and there's some along his right shoulder, but we can see additional clots here on the front of his shirt. Likewise, his nose, we can see some dried blood. It's actually began to crack. So we have this massive blood. It's not uncommon for the blood to begin to crack here. We can see it coming out of his nostril. What we do have, and again, that's why that, and I failed to point it out in one of the previous photos of him on the chair, is if you notice we have a flow pattern. Remember I talked about that before. So blood came out of his nose and it flows down here off to the side of his head. Well, in the previous photograph, there was no flow pattern that existed here. Notice the flow pattern is going down here, so this accounts for him sitting in the chair, but this was not in the previous photo, and we know that he's purging, to use that term, so that's when he's being taken off of the recliner, and his head moves off to the side, and that's what causes that flow. So again, that's post-event, or you might hear me use the term artifact. That was created after he was taken out of the chair.
States 239, you're 23.
So again, we have Mr. Cooper here looking straight down. We can see I've put the green arrow, clots here, giving us some indication of time. Likewise, we can see the green arrow here, or you can see it here, the green arrow, in the same position, whatever's easier if you can't see it back there. But again, we've got a clot going along the shoulder area. So what that's telling us is, now think about it, if he's in position in that chair and we have some bleeding going on, then obviously the blood is going to amass, and the pressure, his pressure of him up against the chair creates, for lack of a better term, a dam, and ultimately that blood pulls up there and may even run across the back of his neck and pool up here, and that's what creates that clot that we see here. Likewise, this is that flow pattern I talked about before, that's post-event or artifact. Notice the blood flow down. Now envision him sitting in the recliner. As he loses it due to the fractures here and it's bleeding, it's going to flow down his face. And then the other thing that we noted is in the video, and I testified, here we had Karina Cooper, and we could see in the video that her face comes in contact with him. And at one point, I don't recall, but I think hand does as well, but that could account for some of that. Remember I talked about that swipe pattern? So in other words, or even white pattern, because now she's moving from this side with the blood to that side, so it could be a swipe or it could be a wipe. Sometimes you hear the term smear when you really can't tell what it is, but certainly there's some motion going on there, and that's what could account for that, or what would account for that.
States Exhibit 240, this is your number 24.
Mm-hmm. Now I've placed 3 green arrows on the recliner. The recliner's been placed down, Mr. Cooper's been removed. So let's just start here. He's seated. Can we turn it? There we go. Oh, much better. Thank you. So he's seated in the recliner here. One of the first things we want to take a look at, and I failed to use this term, there's a term called void. So essentially, if I have something here, and let's just say I place my cup of water here, and I create some spatter around it, well, you would agree with me that if I pick it up, there's an absence of blood there, right? So the fact that I have an absence of blood tells me that something was there to prevent any type of blood from getting there. Well, if you notice, if the person were standing, and we don't see any evidence of Mr. Cooper standing, but if he's bleeding, and I can tell you that he'll immediately begin to bleed, well, we don't see any evidence of blood on the chair or even the back until you get up in this area where his shoulders were, and we can see the corresponding clot to the left shoulder, and we can see the corresponding clot to the right shoulder. Notice here on this yellow square, we have some saturation. So some of that serum and some of the blood does soak into the material, and it's worked its way down here. Granted, the wound is on his left side, so some of that blood does saturate down into the material, and it works its way down here. And notice, remember, wound is on that left side. His head is somewhat tilted this way. Notice the saturation stain continues down into this area here and makes its way all the way here. Likewise, saturation stain along this, I'll call it faux leather or whatever, suede, I guess might be the term. You can see that there's some blood here as well. Actually, there's some clotting there, which makes sense. So essentially, we have this void, an absence of blood, which puts, again, let's take a look at everything, this holistic approach. We have Mr. Cooper up against the recliner back as he's bleeding. The blood essentially is collecting here on his shoulder. It's migrating this way, for the most part flowing down this way, saturating down along the quilt. And ultimately, where he's got his head off to the left, we've got him bleeding into this area where the cushion, arm cushion, comes in contact with this back here. So the fact that we don't have any blood in this area is just another means by which we can confirm or say, hey, he's sitting in the chair at the time of these two shots.
States 241, you're 25.
This is, again, I've put my green arrow in here. This is the clot on the, excuse me, that would be his right side. If you remember back to the photograph with him on the floor with his T-shirt, he had that large clot on his right shoulder. Now this clot on his right shoulder matches up with this clot here on the comforter or quilt on the back of his chair or his recliner. So as he's in this position, that blood is welling up between his shirt, and that's what's causing that clot. So when he's pulled away from there, that leaves that remaining clot on the quilt. Likewise, he's got the corresponding clot on his shoulder. And here we have the this would be looking at the chair. This would be looking at it, the right side. We can see the clot here. In fact, we can see some of the clot falling down. This is most likely when Mr. Cooper, remember the predominance of the blood is flowing this way, it still hadn't totally clotted and dried. So when he's pulled from the chair, this clot begins to flow down the quilt. And if we look here in this area here, we can see how the blood, we have a saturation stain here, but we also have some dripping here. Here's that side arm of the chair. And you notice this dull area right here, dull area right here. Well, that happens to be dried blood on the arm of the chair as well. So that's a coating of dried blood. But what's important here, we have more clotting going down here. So it tells us there's a volume of blood which is either dripping down or seeping down in this area here of the chair.
For the record, that was States Exhibit 242. Your 27 States Exhibit 243.
Yes, so this happens to be again, looking at the chair from the front, this happens to be the right side of the recliner. So again, looking at it the right side, if you were sitting in it, it would be the left side. Mr. Cooper, again, is sitting in the recliner this way. Up here, what we have, as I mentioned before, is that blood staining here. So we have some transfer stains, something wet with blood, I've encircled here. We have a little bit of a saturation stain. Not only that, but you can just about see the flow pattern going down the side of the chair. So we have some flow pattern going down the side of the chair. We can see some blood in here. In other words, blood is running down, just so happens to get inside or in between this upper portion and this side arm of the chair. It's actually running down the side. Not only is it running down the side and amassing here, but it's also running down the interior of the chair. And notice the pool that's amassing back here. This pool is because he's been sitting here for some time, and I can't tell you how long, because if you think about it, there's two factors that directly affect the size of the pool. It's the rate of flow, right? If I turn on my faucet and I just have it dripping along, that's certainly going to take quite a while for that to amass that amount of blood. Likewise, if I open my faucet up, I'm certainly going to have a lot less time. So again, and not only that, but after someone has been shot and they're succumbing to their death, blood pressure is going down, so the rate of flow is not as great as it is as time goes by. So again, to give you a time as to how long that would amass, there's a lot of things that go into that. But what we do know is that he was in this position with a sufficient amount of blood, not only to run down the side of the recliner, but to run in the recliner to create this. And this is separate than this area here. So here we have a pool amassing from blood running down here.
Based on what you're seeing here, is there anything to support the notion that the recliner was moved after the shooting?
No, because we have this flow pattern here, so it's going down, and that's why this is flowing from underneath the recliner. But we also, and I haven't talked about this, this is that drip pattern that I talked about. See all the little satellites that we see here that radiate around that pool? Given this photograph, not only that, but when these satellites hit, here's the other thing, is they come straight out. So here we have that parent pool here. As they come straight out, they're going to skid along here. If you notice, there's no blood really in the section here, because as they hit the corner of this chair, and at the base of this chair, not only do we have the flow pattern here, and I'm getting ahead of myself, we have all those little satellites. As that blood hits that parent stain, that satellite comes up and it's hitting the base of that chair at that low level.
Again, if this is better illustrated in a later photograph, just let me know.
Yes, sir.
I want to get too far ahead, but are you saying that the blood pool that we're seeing immediately next to the recliner is separate and distinct from the parent and satellite stains that are towards the bottom of the photograph?
Yes, sir.
And that's something that will be discussed later?
Coming photos, yes, sir.
State's Exhibit 244, your 28.
Yes, sir. So what we have here is, again, another photograph taken of the chair. Here we have the recliner. And again, the photo allows us to see that there's no blood here. We again see the void here. But now looking in this area, we talked about that saturation as blood's running through the chair. But also now we have that drip pattern. Notice all of the satellite. And we saw in that video that I had, when that single drop dropped into that parent stain, granted there were several stains, but again, the size of this tells me that that pool had some time to amass. Not only that, but there's something over the pool that's dripping down, and with each drip, you're creating these satellite spatter. Notice how they're radiating out. They actually hit this here. They hit the base of this bureau. If anything was moved, if we look at this leg on this bureau, notice if we look at the frequency or the number of blood stains, notice how it's fairly red and sprinkled, or whatever term you want to use. The concentration here, and it goes back this way, but notice there's almost a lack of staining. In fact, right at the base of that foot, it almost appears that there's a lack of stains. So what that says, if anything was moved, that at some point after this, that this was moved just slightly. And what we see here are some marks in the floor. Some things moved across this. Remember I talked about swipes and wipes, but here we have some type of movement, lateral movement across here, and it's going this way. So it probably bumped this and just slightly moved this, maybe a ½ inch at some particular point in time. I have a green arrow here in the foreground, or the lower portion of the photo. Again, we see that bare footprint impression. So we have a bottom of a bare foot, which is contaminated with blood, which is heading from the chair. And if you recall, I noted that, or I mentioned in the reports, there were footprint impressions on the rug, and then we saw those other two impressions that were leading towards that sewing room, towards the stairs. This we have here is we have some motion. Obviously there's been some blood deposition. It's amassed that pool, and we've had something come through and wipe it. And in reviewing the reports, supposedly the victim's son, Cade, I believe his name is, C-A-Y-D, came into the room and slipped and fell. So this would account for this movement of the blood here. If someone were to slip and fall, and envision them slipping and falling, because one of the other things that we look at, many times there's what we refer to as feathering, so we see movement of directionality, moves this way and just slightly bumps this to give us that little, it almost appears to be, it does appear to be a small, or it is a small void right there, as that cabinet is moved. This happens number 4, the placard. What is placard number 4? That's a sample of blood that the investigators took, because again, you want to take samples at various locations to show whose blood it is. And then lastly, placard in the back there, number 5, that's where the expended cartridge case, the 22 long, was located.
Previously referred to as a shell casing, that's what you're talking about, correct?
Shell casing, cartridge case, yes, sir.
State's Exhibit 245, marked in your report as number 29.
So here we have, and let's use that green arrow for reference. That's that footprint, and we can see it's a left foot, and we can see the directionality here is that the big toe as we move around, so we've got the left foot, and it's moving away from the actual pool here. Interestingly enough, what we don't see is if this foot were to get contaminated, where is the area of, let's just call it a negative impression where they picked up the blood? We don't see that. So normally what happens is, or what we have here is someone had stepped in the blood. Evidence of that is disappeared or is been masked over by the accumulation of blood into this pool here. So any indication, because certainly there's not enough blood here in this satellite spatter to have created the large barefoot impression, someone would have had to step here and to go over in this direction. Also, what we have here is, notice all of these spatter heading out. If you look, you can see the elongated stains. Remember we talked about that before? Tails are going this way. So as that blood is dripping down, we have that drip pattern, drip, drip, drip. So what's happening is that's very low, it's on the floor, correct? So when those spatters are coming out, some of them are coming directly out. So they're, to use the term which might make it easier, they're almost skidding along the floor. So we have those elongated stains. While some of them, as the blood is dripping in, that blood, as it drips in, it comes out and drops over, and you get those circular stains. But for the most part, everything is coming back to here, here, here. And the other thing that we want to look at is, okay, if this is originating here, then we should have something here, which we do. We should have something here, and you can see it in this photograph right there. Some of that spatter is making it all the way out to here. And likewise, when we look at some additional photos, we'll see spatter on the front of this jug or whatever the clay, whatever this is. But again, what we want to do is to show that if I have that type of pattern, this drip pattern, then I should look for and find that radiating spatter coming from that stain. And what it tells me is important is something, and I'm tipping and it makes it difficult to hear, but obviously the blood source is above it. It's above that area and it's dripping into it. So if I'm sitting in the recliner and I back up like this, it's not possible for me to create that drip pattern. The only way that drip pattern could have been created is the source has to be out over that floor to drip down into that pre-existing stain.
So if I understand your testimony correctly, then based on your review of the blood patterns that you're seeing here, the body was in at least 2 separate positions?
Yes, sir.
And the position of the body in the recliner, you talked about the clots of blood on the shoulder, you talked about the flow patterns down to the base of the recliner, are consistent with Mr. Cooper's body sitting in the recliner?
Yes, sir.
And then you're talking about this parent stain and the satellite stains that are much further out, indicating that the source of blood must come from above, correct?
There has to be obviously a break. It's not flowing down something, otherwise it would flow and just amass, as we saw in that previous photo of that stain amassing in the back of the chair. In this particular case, I have to be above it because, again, all of the spatter, all of that satellite spatter is radiating all the way around, or 360 degrees. So it's dripping into that center, and there's some slight movement, but again, all of those stains are radiating out.
So this isn't coming from Mr. Cooper?
As he's found, no, sir.
Not as he's found, in other words, reclining in the recliner?
In the first officer photographs that we've previously looked at, he was not in that position, no, sir.
And as you indicated previously, there's no flow pattern down his left arm. Why is that relevant to this image here and what you were just talking about?
Sure. It's certainly possible, and again, we have to entertain all possibilities, where if he were, and let's just say unintentionally, Karina Cooper, who we know was on him, picked his arm up only to hold on to him or to embrace him, certainly we want to take a look at his left arm because we know the injury is on his left side. So as I'm sitting there back up against the chair, blood is amassing. Some of it's going to flow down my arm, so it could be possible that as my arm is extended out over the recliner, that it could be dripping off the tip of my finger or fingers, but we don't see that. We actually see his arm clean, and it's actually within the arm of the chair. So again, that's not, and again, look at all the possibilities, his arm wasn't extended out. The most likely position is that, or what is most likely is Mr. Cooper is in this position where he's over the arm of the chair to allow for that dripping to collect and create those satellite spatter.
So if I understand correctly, there's no flow pattern down the arm, so it didn't come from his arm hanging over, essentially what you're referring to as this parent stain.
Correct.
And if I understand your testimony, you stated that it's instead the source of the blood above this parent stain would be directly from the wound in his face, on the left side of his face?
Yes, sir.
State's exhibit number 246, your number 30.
So, again, as I mentioned before, when we look at and we do our bloodstain analysis, we need to look at the entire scene, right? And if something doesn't make sense, we have to go back. Here we're talking about a drip pattern, so we have blood dripping into blood. We do know that the satellites are going to radiate out, and if you notice here, there's that container that I previously talked about. Notice the spatter. This is the portion that's closest to that drip pattern, so therefore the most of the predominant number of stains are going to be here, and we can also see that we have some spatter here. So again, everything is corroborating or supporting the fact that that's a drip pattern. Not only that, but that these two jugs or these two containers were there at the time of the event and weren't moved subsequent, because that's not uncommon where someone may try to alter the scene. But certainly, could their positions have slightly moved? Yes. Normally what I do is I would circle this with a Sharpie marker, then I would lift it up, push it off to the side, and I would take a photo of that silhouette just to show either that wasn't moved or it was moved. So there's things you could do. The other important thing to track here is we've seen the footprints on the other side of this rug. The report talked about bloody footprints crossing the rug, but again, or here we have another one of those. In this case, it's a left footprint moving towards that rug. So what we've done, unlike that drip stain at the bottom of the stairs, when you look at the footprints, we can see that the footprints directionality come from that area by the recliner. The footprints head towards the rug, and then of the photos that I had with the footprints, they come from the rug heading towards the sewing room. So based upon, as I mentioned before, I don't have all of the pieces or all of the photos. It appears that someone tracked blood from the pool or from the side of the recliner, moving this way across the rug and then towards that sewing room.
And you had stated previously that looking at that pool, you didn't see essentially a void or another place that could have sourced essentially the blood from that footprint.
Yes, sir.
What does that tell you about the timing of when that footprint occurred versus the bloodletting event?
So the footprint had to have been, or the foot had to be contaminated with blood prior to that blood amassing over the evidence of the foot being there. So in other words, if I step in the blood, and let's just say I take another step, or as I pick it up, sometimes we'll actually have what's called a negative impression. As I pick the blood up, it's no longer red, it's literally white or lighter because I've lifted the blood on the bottom of my foot. So instead of this red surface, I have this silhouette of a foot, which is lighter in color. I'm not saying white, but it's certainly lighter in color because now I've tracked up, or it's contaminated the bottom of my foot and taken a second step. So what we do note is we don't see that within the pool. So again, when we look at timing, that came earlier on, and I can't tell you when, but obviously prior to the blood covering over any evidence of that footprint's origination or the area it came from.
States 247, you're 31.
Yes, sir. So again, I mentioned this before. Placard number 5 here is the shell casing or cartridge case of the 22 that was located near the door. Here we have the quilt, the back of the quilt here, the recliner. Notice, remember we talked about this before. If I have a source up here over, and I have to have a distance for that to drop to hit the floor, an unimpeded drop, right? There's nothing there. Well, as that drops down into this pool, the pool's going to get larger, and you notice all the satellite spatter being created. Likewise, or here I have the edge of the recliner. Granted, if that next droplet hits here, it's going to hit the side of the recliner, which we noticed, and if you follow this across, there comes an area where there's no blood at all. So that actual side of the recliner becomes, if you, for lack of a better term, as a shade. So as that blood drips here, and those satellites hit that, or head in this direction, they actually hit the side of the chair, and that's why we don't see anything here. So again, when we look at this, going back, we have to look at all of these pieces, and the fact that we're behind the chair places something above, dripping down, creating that satellite spatter, radiating out all the way over to the wall here, all the way to here.
And again, none of that satellite spatter could be formed by him sitting in a reclining position in the chair.
Oh, no. Some of it could, and again, could be masked over, but that second shot I talked about, but not like this. You might have some fine misting, but just to say what could have been possible to be part of that pool, but for the most part, that's all due to the drip stain.
States 248, you're 32.
Now, this is the cabinet that I talked about before, where it looked like it may have slightly moved. This is the front door, east wall. What we have here is the door shut. I've circled some representative blood stains. I didn't circle all of the stains, but you can see there's some, that spatter, circular stains hitting the wall that have been circled. May I stand, Your Honor? Just for this one.
You may.
I have a green arrow which has been placed in the photograph, and what I'm showing there is the trim board, or depends, some people call it a mop board here, where we can see some additional spatter, and the number of spatter is higher there because it's lower to the ground, so that's satellite spatter. In this case here, we have some spatter up by the light switch. Now, to say that's due to the dripping going down, unlikely that distance away, because what happens is it starts to fall back to the ground. So you say, what could be the source of this spatter? Well, if I have a second gunshot wound, that first wound creates that pool, and when I incur, or when the victim incurs that second, that could be some of that back spatter created by that second wound. Because to say this up by the light switch, and I think your average light switch is about 38 inches or whatever, about 40 inches above the ground, you wouldn't see this, you wouldn't expect that. So it had to have been from another mechanism. And the only other mechanism that we have to create spatter, small little stains like that, would be that second shot.
So to be clear, that's not satellite from the drip stain. The blood that we see in States Exhibit 248, marked as year 32, is from another mechanism which you're describing as the second gunshot, and some of that is on the door here that's closed.
Yes, sir.
States Exhibit 249, and that's your 33.
So I've circled, and if you notice, I didn't circle all of the spatter. I tried, and there's another small one there, but trying to show the number of stains, and we can even see at the top here, granted we have this blocking it, but if you notice the height of that spatter, that's not consistent with that drip pattern, because the further you go out and you notice, or you could see from the photographs, this is quite a distance away. And even when you looked at that radiating pattern on the floor, as you looked at the pattern on the floor, when you started to move away, notice how the number of stains started to decrease because they just can't make it out that far. So for these stains to make it up to this level here, and again, I'm not sure how high that switch is, certainly that had to be from another mechanism. And again, the size of the stains, we don't have a scale or a piece of ruler tape here, but certainly they're very small stains. So when you look at the possible mechanisms that are out there, that second gunshot, because here I have that amassed amount of blood, that gases and whatever, or that round when it hits, could cause that spatter to end up on the wall here.
This is your 34. It states 250.
Yes, sir. This is this grate here, this is for the air conditioning or the heating, whatever it is, but this was in this position here. It's been taken off and moved off to the side, but what we're looking at is, notice the number of stains here, and there's actually really a break between the stains. This is where that switch was, but if you notice some of that spatter, that satellite spatter is making its way over. The frequency increases as I get lower along there. So again, that goes along with that drip pattern, but now let's move across here. That drip pattern or that spatter appears here, it appears here and here. So if you recall, that door, at least in that officer body cam, was closed at the time. This certainly here, this spatter on the lower portion of the door, supports the fact that that door was closed at the time of some of that spatter. Not only that, but in the reports that I reviewed, the crime scene investigators or the investigators on scene noted that at the bottom, that's an aluminum door, that's the pump. They refer to that as the pump. They did note, although they didn't photograph, the fact that there was some spatter on there as well.
And just to be clear, we saw an earlier image that vent was in fact covered, and this has been moved by the crime scene team.
That vent literally goes back here. This was removed by investigators to take photos of the actual scene itself.
Your number 35, it states 251.
So this is a better view, or actually a view of the door. And notice the circular stains or some elliptical stains, because again, it's going to be coming this way. As we move to the left, that couch, that recliner is actually blocking the path of the blood. So we would anticipate at some point that we're starting to lose that frequency or number of stains as we move to the left. Here we can see one here, we can see a small one here, we can see here. But again, for the most part, they're all very low to the ground here. This appears to be some type of transfer stain, something coming in contact with the door at some particular point. And if you notice, it actually only goes to the base of the door. It doesn't continue. So that gives you some indication that possibly the door was open at some point.
This then would be, your 36 states 252.
Mm-hmm. So this is a photograph taken by investigators. They've placed the number 10 here. But if you look at the photograph, you notice that there are some blood stains on the door here, and they are directed this way. So we have some blood stains, and in the next photograph we see a closer view. But what this tells you is, excuse me, if the door is open, envision this spatter coming out and hitting the door. Remember I talked about that angle? So if blood's coming in at an angle, I wouldn't expect stains on that door to be circular. They should be skidding along the front of the door. So I'd expect these elliptical stains on the front of the door. Not only that, but if you notice, this is I call this the door jamb or the casing. Actually, this is the casing here. I don't see any spatter here because what happens is, and you say, well, if the door is open, why don't I have any blood here? Because think about it, straight line, and this is where photographs become deceiving. Because if blood's coming in a straight line, it's going to hit the casing, which we did see in the previous photos, but blood isn't going to come this way, then come around the corner and hit that edge of the door. So I would think, unless there's a transfer stain, which we don't see, but the blood, which we did see in previous photos, we see spatter on that casing, that trim going around the door, which is called casing. We don't see anything here. So going back to looking from all the different views, that drip pattern, everything is making sense that the only way that could have happened is that blood source had to be above the floor, some distance, and I can't tell you, but it was dripping there. Didn't necessarily have to stay in a single position, could be moving, but that's what created that satellite spatter.
Your 37 states 253.
Now this I would call a medium to a close-up range. They've placed the ruler tape or the scale here. This is metric, so it can be a little deceiving, so be careful. Yeah, it is metric. So essentially, even though you see a 2.5 is an inch, 2.54 centimeters. So when you're trying to gauge the size of these, this is roughly an inch, this is roughly an inch. But notice the difference. Remember I talked about that? If the door is open, here I have the door open. If you look at my hand, here if the door is open and the spatter's coming this way, what's it going to do? It's going to skid along the door, and we're going to see these elliptical stains, the elongated stains. So as I look, here I see the elongated stains or elliptical stains, and I enunciate the elongated, but notice the tail's going this way. That's pretty evident here, right? All of those tails. Now you say, well, how come this is going this way, this is going this way? Ultimately, that's gravity. Notice how those stains start to radiate out and they start to drop off. Well, those are the stains starting to finally, they lose all of that energy they have. This one here is still going. That's still going across. It's still slightly upward. And what we have here, these are just starting to fall off. But the important thing is the only way that could occur is the door has to be open at the time these stains hit. So while Mr. Cooper is dripping into that pattern, that door is open. I can't tell you how much, because one of the things I did look for was a void on the floor, because if the stains are hitting the door, not only do they hit the side, this is the outside of the door. Now remember, outside, this is outside. On the other side of the door, if you remember, they were circular stains because the door was closed. Well, what we would look for is if that door is positioned over a certain portion of the floor, then it's reasonable to assume that I would have a void or a shadow where the door was. But in looking at the floor, I couldn't determine exactly where the door was. Because could the door have moved slightly a little this way or slightly a little that way? Absolutely. So it wasn't fixed, or at least I couldn't determine that. And now, this is an important photo. Now, in context, this is the edge of the door. Look at the difference of the shape of the stains here. For the most part, they're all circular. So here I have that door. If you look, here's my door here. Is that door is open. That edge of the door is facing what? It's facing that parent pool. As those droplets are heading towards the door, they're going to hit the door and it's straight on. So as we know, for the most part, they're going to be circular. Now when I go to the side of that door, so here I have that door in position, what I anticipate, and I see somewhat, I do have some stains going. Could that be the door slightly moving? But the majority of these stains, are circular. Notice the frequency increases as I drop down. But if you notice, they're all pretty much circular. Where on that side of the door facing outside, they were all angular stains or elongated. So here's the door open. This happens to hit here. Satellite hits here, it's circle. This one just happens to hit on the outside side, and that's why you get your elliptical. And ultimately, again, some of them are falling off due to gravity. So when you look at it independently, you've got the inside of the door, which tells me the door was closed at some time. This edge of the door, along with the outside of the door, independently tell me that the door was open for a period of time. And again, we can't tell you how long because we don't know the rate of dripping, okay? It was open for some point and then ultimately closed by the time first officers got there.
And again, to be clear, these satellite stains that we're seeing all originate from Mr. Cooper's body being in a position where it's out over above that parent stain, not where first responders found him sitting reclined in the recliner.
No. No, sir.
No, as in you agree with me and that's correct?
I'm sorry. Yes, I agree with you. No.
to make sure.
I apologize, yes.
Just for the
Mr.
sake of the
Cooper-
record. All right. This is states 255. It's your 39. What are we seeing here?
So this is a photograph, my photograph, and what I was noticing in processing as I mentioned before, I use Photoshop to enhance process some of the images. At least with Photoshop, some things are underexposed or whatever, and I can lighten up those areas to see what's there. Well, in this particular case here, what I did was blood, as we know, is red. I made it dark. I made all of the reds dark or dark blue or black. And what we can see, or at least what I was able to determine, is I have three areas. The red, I have a green, and a blue, because I want to differentiate. This is the door right here, and we can see this is the base of the door at the lower portion of the photograph. So that I would call the base of the door. That's the sweep. That's that rubber portion that stops the drafts from coming in. This is the casing, so we're looking straight down. So if the door were to open, the door is going to open this way here. The door is going to open this way here. And what I'm showing is there are two, let's start with the red. There's one footprint. As we've talked about before, there are footprints that show up. This is a bloody footprint, and it's pointing towards the door. It happens to be a right foot. In the green here and in the blue here, there is a footwear impression. In other words, a shoe, or some type of shoe, athletic shoe or whatever it is, some type of shoe with an outsole design created a bloody impression here and a similar impression here.
This is your 40. It states Exhibit 256.
Mm-hmm. So what you can see here, again, we have the red, which is the bloody foot. But if you look here, this is the edge of a shoe here. And we can actually see the diamonds, very similar to what we saw outside. Not only that, but in one of the other photos coming up, you'll be able to see the diamonds. This is the edge of the shoe here. So and how I can delineate or how I can tell them apart, this is the edge of the shoe, so there's a constant size to it, a strip to it. So that's bloodied and comes in contact with the floor here, likewise here, and then the actual design of the shoe is in here, likewise it's back in here as well. And you'll see that when I take the photos of just the green and just the blue area.
And also there, with the red square around it, is that?
That's the bloody footprint, yes, sir. That's the right bare foot.
Again, oriented towards that door?
Towards the door, yes. This is the door, if I may. This is the base of the door here. This is that oak threshold that you would step on if you open the door. And I refer to this as the sweep or the weather stripping at the base of the door.
Same question that I had for you earlier. We were talking about a footprint that was near the parent stain and the satellite stains. And I asked you about essentially the timing of the formation of that footprint in relation to the blood pool that we were seeing, the drip stains and the satellite stains. Are you able to say anything about the timing of the formation of this particular footprint?
Well, not only this footprint, but also of the other two footwear impressions, that here we have the base in the blue and the green of a shoe which was contaminated with blood. Likewise, we have this barefoot impression here, but we don't see any evidence of where that shoe may have picked up the blood. So we do know that this pool has amassed, so apparently the best explanation is that they were contaminated prior to that pool making its way or enlarging, engulfing whatever evidence may have been there, or any indication of that's where the shoe, in this case, or the footprint was contaminated or picked up blood.
And Judge, this may be a good time to break for lunch.
Yeah, we're right at noon, so ladies and gentlemen, we'll take our lunch break at this point, so I ask that you be back here ready to go at 1:30. And again, I would just remind you of the admonition, just again, keep an open mind, don't talk to anybody about the case, don't let anybody talk to you about the case, don't do any sort of investigation or research on your own, and avoid any and all media accounts, including traditional and social media, as it relates to this case. So with that, I hope you all have a good lunch.